Just started using this analogy with my clients recently where I have what I call the powerhouse veggie. So that's like your tomatoes and your peppers, the big ones that need a lot of space and a lot of water. And then in the cool weather, that's like your broccoli and your cauliflower. And I tell them, like, think about that as like your furniture in your house, like your couch, your recliner. Like that's like the big stuff. Okay. You wouldn't put your couch next to your couch next to your couch, but you might take your couch and put it next to a side table. Okay. So think about like your tomato is your couch. And then what are we going to put? What's the side table? Maybe it's like a marigold. Okay. And then we need a lamp. So, think about those flowers and herbs as accessories because they complement one another, but they don't compete with one another. And it's like you can see this light bulb because everybody knows what a couch looks like next to a side table.
Welcome back to The Beet. I am Jacques from Jacques in the Garden, and today we have a special guest on, Emily Grohovsky from Cedar Hill Gardens. Why don't you introduce us, where you're from, where you're growing, what zone you're in, and what you're all about?
Thank you. Yes. So I am in central Mississippi, in Madison specifically. I garden in zone 8, 8B specifically, since the restructuring of everything. So we just finished planting for summer, and
great.
I grew up in Mississippi, and I knew very little about gardening, but kind of watched my grandparents from afar as I grew up, and I think I cared more about the pool than I did about the garden. So I didn't learn a whole lot, but maybe through osmosis, I learned what was possible, I think. And so, I own a business here called Cedar Hill Gardens. We're a kitchen garden company specifically, and we do turnkey garden installations. But the difference is we come back and we teach our clients how to actually grow food. Because what's the point if you have, a garden, but you can't grow anything in it?
Yeah. And actually, I think a lot of people think like, oh, I don't know how to garden. I don't have a green thumb. I don't have any experience with this. But now I have a garden, so you're actually there to help them through that process and actually gain something along the way, so that they can take over on their own. And actually, really quick, before we get into teaching people how to actually grow a green thumb, can you define what a kitchen garden means for anyone who's wondering different breakdowns?
Sure. I'm actually kind of excited that kitchen garden is becoming kind of a household term. And everybody's really into gardening right now, specifically growing food, and that's what I teach. So I don't do landscaping, I don't do hydrangeas and azaleas and things like that. But I specifically put in raised bed gardens for people, and we teach them how to grow vegetables and herbs. If they have the space for it, we'll teach them how to grow, berry bushes and fruit trees and things like that. But we are doing things that we can cut and bring into the kitchen and use them.
Gotcha. So it's a garden that's focused primarily on eating, supplying food for you, your family, and actually cooking in the kitchen. For me, actually, that's why I got into gardening in the first place once you have some homegrown produce, it's kind of hard to go back. Once you have a tomato from your own garden, it's really, there's no substitute. So for me, I love the idea of a kitchen garden. I think not only does it empower people to want to garden because you get food out of it, but it also helps teach you how to cook more and get in the kitchen more and get more involved with food in general. So I just love the idea overall. And I love the fact that you go back and teach people. So when you're saying not everyone might necessarily have a green thumb to begin with, do you find that people you install gardens for, do they know what they're getting into? Is it, I want a garden, I don't know anything about it, and now I have one? Or is it a little bit of a mix?
I do hear that a lot. If I had $1 every time I heard, I have a black thumb, or I could kill a cactus. I do hear that a lot. But the thing that gets me the most excited about gardening is that I don't say every time, but 99% of the time, when I meet with a new client, they'll start to tell me a story about who the garden reminds them of. So they'll say, my grandmother had peach trees, or, I remember my dad grew, peas, and we would shell peas on the porch or whatever. So I think people have a concept of what they're getting into in the sense that they've seen someone do it before, and maybe they don't have good memories as a child of pulling peas or shelling peas, but deep down, they have this core memory from the garden.
Right.
And so I think they know what they're getting into, but people are much more excited about it when they know that we're coming back to help them. Because like our culture is so pass-fail, right? And you kind of have to like shake off that mentality in the garden because you have to kill a few plants to learn how to grow a few plants. So that's why, like, on the back of my staff t-shirt, it literally has a thumb and it says, green thumbs are not natural, they are learned. And that's my company's motto. So
yeah, I think it's not only is it true, like for a fact it's true, but it's also really, it is an important message because I think a lot of people watch like maybe content online and they see gardens, they're like, oh my God, my garden doesn't look like that. But like, I like to show some failures as well. Like nothing is perfect in the gardening world, especially at the beginning. Like if you do not have those learning moments where you make mistakes, then you can't really learn how to get better. So it's like, if everything just goes really well and you're offhand, then you don't really understand what's happening. It just happens to be working. But having some amount of mistakes along the way really is a great teaching opportunity. And so like when, for you, for example, like you've installed these gardens at so many different places, like what's like is there like a common thing that people really, like they start to get it, but like there's one overall challenge that seems to be a consistent thing?
Well, I think that people are just shocked. My favorite thing is to start a client, because a lot of them I start them with transplants, because that's a little bit more like beginner and, kind of like get them all to start. But my favorite thing is when I go back for the second season, and by then we've been practicing like planting from seed. And like I went to a client's house the other day, we were going to do her planting for the summer, and she had almost all seeds with her. And she was like, I said, Jessica, look at this. You're planting your whole garden from seed. And last year, you didn't even know how to read a seed packet. And so I think when people realize how I don't want to say easy it is to plant from seed, but you know what I mean? It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit of timing and following directions. And then to see a minuscule seed go from that to like a 3-foot wide cabbage, and then you like cut it up for Thanksgiving. I mean, that is the wow moment for most people.
Yeah.
They say, I didn't realize how easy it was going to be. They think it's super hard. But I tell people, I'm like, so I'm not a runner. And I try to relate this to people in whenever they're interested in. But I say to them, like, what if I told you, like, I'm not a runner, like, I tried to run a marathon one time and it just didn't work. And you were like, well, what shoes did you wear? And I'd say, well, I wore flip-flops. And you're like, well, what did you drink before you ran? I'm like, well, I had, Diet Coke, whatever. Well, of course you couldn't run a marathon. Like, you had the wrong tools. You were doing it, in a completely different way than I would teach you. But once I gave you the right tools, you might have a totally different experience. That's what I'm trying to provide for people.
Oh, that's actually really fascinating because I never really thought about it like that. I think that's a great analogy because if somebody walks out into their backyard and they just see like grass or dirt, they're like, where do I even begin? But even you just coming in and helping them get started and showing them, like, I mean, ideally, like in the end, most plants just want to grow, right? Like they want to survive and become something. So it's like, we're just kind of helping them along the way.
They do. They want to grow. It's the craziest thing.
Yeah. So that's amazing. I think speaking of like some of the issues that people might run into is that when you go out in the garden, like there's so much going on that you start looking for solutions like, oh, why is my tomato leaf yellow? And why is this not growing so fast? And you start looking online, you get overwhelmed by all the information out there. And this is something that seems like you run into a lot. So I'd love to talk to you about this next, sort of the trap of analysis paralysis.
So when I started gardening during COVID, then that was really when my journey began. I'm not an astronomer. I don't have a horticulture degree. Like I purely self-taught. I was a mom with 2 little boys under 2 who were very active, and I needed something to do outside for myself and for them. And so I just started gardening. And a lot of what I learned was from YouTube and, Instagram gardeners and watching videos and such. Well, then I started learning terms like companion planting and interplanting. I'm like, oh, what is this? Well, I'm a rule follower. I'm firstborn, so I'm going to go on my website and it would say, always plant your green beans with your strawberries. And then the next thing would say, never plant green beans with strawberries. And I was like, oh my gosh, like no matter what I do, I'm going to do it wrong. And so there is a little rebellious side of me too, which finally I was like, you know what? Just this, I'm not going to listen to any of this, and I'm just going to start planting stuff, which was so interesting because what I learned was companion planting can be very strategic and helpful when you use things like, herbs and certain flowers that deter pests,
absolutely,
or trap crops that, pull pests a certain way. But the actual, are you going to have 100 more tomatoes if you plant this next to a carrot as opposed to this next to a pepper? In my experience, it just has not mattered that much. It's more about the actual spacing between whatever the plant is next. And so when I do a lot of speaking engagements and consults, people always ask me that question, and they're excited to say, well, should I plant my onions next to this? And I'm like, well, you can, but it doesn't matter. And they're like, what do you mean? But I thought you had to plant this. And I'm like, you know what? Free yourself up. If you want to try something out like you do, Jacques, experimenting or whatever, that's fine. But you're not going to have you're not going to make some major devastating mistake in your garden if you try, planting this next to this. So I would say take things with a grain of salt on the internet that you read about, and also know that it's really important to I feel like on Instagram and stuff, if you don't follow gardeners that are in your zone and then you try to do what they're doing, it's not going to probably work in your garden because you're not in the same climate. So, find people who have similar soil to you, or find people who have similar climate to you.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important thing to think about, is that even when you find information online, like those companion plant suggestions, you'll find 4 different articles that say the 20 best plants for tomatoes, companion planting. And sure, a lot of them could work. And in reality, there's not necessarily always a inherent benefit that one offers the other, but maybe it's just that they can tolerate each other. Like a tomato is going to grow tall, so I like to plant lettuce underneath it because it's not going to outcompete, and it's going to get a little shade from the tomatoes. But it's not like they're working together as true companions. They just happen to be okay with each other. And I think that's the other important thing that you brought up.
I just started using this analogy with my clients recently, where I have what I call the powerhouse veggie. So that's your tomatoes and your peppers, the big ones that need a lot of space and a lot of water. And then in the cool weather, that's your broccoli and your cauliflower. And I tell them think about that as your furniture in your house, your couch, your recliner. That's the big stuff. Okay. You wouldn't put your couch next to your couch, but you might take your couch and put it next to a side table. Okay. So think about your tomato is your couch. And then what are we going to put? What's the side table? Maybe it's a marigold. Okay. And then we need a lamp. So, think about those flowers and herbs as accessories because they complement one another, but they don't compete with one another. And it's you can see this light bulb because everybody knows what a couch looks like next to a side table. So I like that analogy.
That's a lovely analogy. Yeah. And I love that. That's great. And I love analogies in general, so keep them coming. But the other thing that you mentioned was...
This is now an analogy podcast.
Yeah. But different soil, different climate. I'm in San Diego. It's zone 10B. People think it's hot. Actually, not crazy hot. It just doesn't get very cold. My soil is different. One of the most challenging things, I think, for people to get over this analysis paralysis thing is the most common question I get is, how much do I water my plants? I don't know. Depends on your soil, depends on how much sunlight you're getting. Are you in a windy area? How big is this plant now? Are we now in summer? Are we early spring? Do you have mulch? Do you not have mulch? There's so many things that go into it. And really, in the end, kind of going back to our first part of our conversation, is you have to just do stuff and make mistakes maybe along the way. And you're going to figure it out because every garden is its own unique sort of assemblage of different things going on. And even if a house 4 houses over could have a slightly different microclimate, maybe they don't get any wind, they don't have to deal with that. So there aren't straightforward answers. There are practices and there are general rules of thumb, but getting out there and learning is the best way to doing it. You just have to experience it. And so finding information online, I do it all the time still too. I'm not saying don't do that, but you have to look at a lot of things. You have to think about it, maybe think of the context of your area. And that's really going to be what gets you free of this paralysis. Because there's just too much. It's overwhelming, simply.
don't you feel for those new gardeners? Don't
Oh
you
yeah.
remember having that question? Like, am I watering? You know, they say if you don't water your plants enough, they will die. If you water your plants too much, they will die. And you're like, thank you. That is very
Yeah.
helpful. Now I'm really stressed out.
Yeah.
I always feel for people when they ask me the watering question. But yeah, that's a
And this
good
is
one.
like an important thing of like what you're doing is like you're having a business, but you're also like teaching people how to have a culture around gardening. Because I think a lot of people here are missing
Mm-hmm.
that culture, like your family history, like you mentioned, like you watched your
Mm-hmm.
grandparents, like maybe you were just there for the pull, but you probably picked up some things along the way. Whereas a lot of people in
For
other
sure.
places, like maybe they grew up with it and it's part of them and they have like some
Mm-hmm.
inherent know-how, but that's just something you have to gather on your own in a lot of cases. So yeah, super interesting to think about the analysis paralysis and just getting out there and doing
And I
it.
think it also depends on your personality too. Like your
Yeah.
analysis paralysis depends on your
Yeah,
personality.
actually, that's a super interesting thing because I really wanted to talk to you about this is the idea of how our personalities actually manifest themselves in the garden. Because I know this is true. I've experienced it with Kevin. There's a lot here. So I'm going to let you kick it off maybe. And then maybe I'll talk a little bit about my personality in the garden because it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah, I'm a little bit of a hodgepodge gardener myself. So I really love watching uh, my clients set up their gardens, think about how they want to do their gardens, organize their gardens, because I can tell very quickly within meeting somebody and talking to them, like I can almost picture kind of like how their garden will look. And a lot of
Yeah.
times it's like how their house looks.
Yeah.
But it's just the way that in which we organize things. And so I just love watching people's strengths come out immediately and then also encouraging them to like kind of explore other ways of doing things and become comfortable with that or give some pushback, you know. So I have my clients that I meet and I'm like, oh, we're definitely doing their lettuce in rows and we are spacing them with a ruler.
Exact. Yeah.
And then
Straight lines.
I have my clients who will like take a handful of seeds and throw it over their shoulder and call it a day, you know. And then I did meet with one lady one time and I asked her a question. I was having a feeling that maybe her issue was not watering enough. And I said, well, how do you water? And she said, oh, I have a Darwinian approach to all of this. So, you know, whatever lives, lives. And I was like, okay, you do you. So it's just been really interesting to watch people's personalities come out in the
Yeah.
garden.
I guess for me, like I was trying to think of an analogy since we're on the analogy train. Is that my gardening style? If you saw my browser tabs and my inbox, it's pretty close to my garden style. It's like all the options are still there. Nothing has been removed. Like I haven't deleted anything. Like it's all here. It's but then reality kicks in. I'm like, oh, now I can't find where that window was, and I have to start doing a little bit of organizing. I start closing tabs, like maybe open a new window. It's like it's exactly like my garden. I have everything going at once. I have a general plan of what I want to grow, but I don't have like a plan. I don't know like I'm putting
Mhm.
this there this time. That's gonna grow for 6 months, and then I'm gonna put this over here. I use a ruler, but I don't. Nothing is straight. Like I use a ruler to be
Yeah.
like, okay, like I want to be
Well,
at
you're doing
least
better
like
than me
20
if you
inches
use
or
a
so.
ruler.
Yeah, like sometimes I'll break out the tape measure, but mostly it's just honestly by feel. And for me, like that's kind of been part of why I like gardening so much is like the personality connection is it's almost like an outlet of creativity where I'm like piecing together
Yes.
a painting that I don't even know what the painting is yet. Like I'm building it, I'm seeing elements, like maybe I just put some mountains in the back. I'm like, oh, you know what? Like some trees would be really great over here to help like balance that out. But I'm not like pre-planning, I'm not measuring, I don't have any system. Whereas like working with Kevin, like at the beginning, Kevin was like, here's my spreadsheet of all my fruit trees, like when they're gonna ripen, when they're ready, like and I was like, this
Oh,
is
wow.
amazing. Because like now like I started to understand it because I was like, well, now I know if I choose these 12 trees, I'll have fruit over like a long period of time instead of everything being ready at once. So I started to pick up a little bit. It used to be like very straight row garden, everything's in a box and it's all spaced in a grid. And now I think I've influenced him a little bit to reveal the truth of like some amount of looseness in the background. And I think also
Hmm.
like this whole discussion, it's like there is not a right personality for somebody, right? And there's not a right gardening style for everybody. So it's it's totally like for you, like how would you classify yourself? How's your personality, I guess, manifest itself in the garden?
So my husband is now working with me full time
Very
at
cool.
Cedar Hill Gardens. We both used to be medical professionals, and I was a nurse. He was a physical therapist, and he's been with us for a year now. And the reason I'm bringing him up is because about once a week, my husband will just walk by and very quietly in my ear, he'll whisper, "Systems. We need systems." And so I know that about myself. I'm definitely like a hodgepodge gardener, and so I try to, what I like about that is the look of my garden, like you talk about it being like a painting or, like a creation. I'm very like right brained. And so that part of me thrives in the garden and I like it. But at the same time, I have realized the benefit sometimes of kind of, at least making somewhat of a plan before I go out. And like now I have a template. I actually have a template of my garden that I can fill in. And I don't always do that perfectly, but at least I know like what's coming up next or whatever. But if you had told me when I started gardening that I would have to do that, that would have stressed me out so much that I'd probably be like, well, gardening is not for me. So I like to see how people's kind of personalities or gardening ways they do it kind of change over time. So, but I definitely lean towards that cottagey hodgepodge. So one of the things I like to do, and I don't tell my clients this, I plant surprise sunflowers in their gardens, especially the new ones. Now the old ones know I do it. But like when we're doing a planting, like I just won't tell them and I'll like pop like a purple sunflower in or like a yellow. And then I'll get a text and they'll be like, what is this? Is this a weed or a plant? And I'm like, oh, just let it keep growing. And they're always like, where did this come from? And I'm like, gardening magic. I don't know. But I don't know. There's a little bit of whimsy that I like.
I think you're totally right about how, like, if you had, like, for example, if I had a checklist or if I knew that I had to have all these different rules and orders in order to have a successful garden, that would have been very challenging for me. It's actually something that I think I've figured out along the way is that one of the benefits, for example, of me being in San Diego is that I could get away with the lack of planning because here I have much longer season. I have much more opportunity to sort of pick up any mistakes along the way. Maybe I started my tomatoes too late. It's okay because my season's so long. So for me, like that's been kind of the crutch that I could lean on to make my personality work. And over the time, I have developed a little bit of note taking, try to be a little bit more mindful in the garden. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on like knowing now that like a garden does sort of relate to your personality in some way. How do we avoid our personality sort of setting us up for a failure? And how do we get past that sort of pass fail and just adapt?
It's so cliched, but you know how people, there's that saying that it's like, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. You know, but it's so true in gardening. And I try to remind people, like what I've started doing is when I go meet with a client, what I noticed was the very first thing that people would show me in their garden was what wasn't working. Like they would take me almost like in this like shameful, they'd be like, come see this pepper that won't grow. And I was like, I'm like looking at this like lush garden with like trellises of pole beans and all this stuff. And then like, it's like, but this pepper won't grow. And so I kind of go into mama mode and I'm like, okay, tell me 5 things that you're proud about in your garden right now. And so I don't know. I think I'm saying that to them as much as I am to myself. It's so easy just in our culture in general. It's so easy to focus on like the one thing that's not working, you know? So I try to like remind myself and talk to myself like I would like talk to my kids. You know, if my kids brought me this like beautiful drawing and they were like, but I got outside the lines here, I'd be like, oh my gosh, who cares? So I think you just have to keep like patting yourself.
But it's like, look at your lettuce. It doesn't matter if it's out of the lines. It looks great.
Yeah. And I think just like focusing on the things that are working and the fact that like there is no possible way, like I would bet you $1 million that I don't have. There is no possible way that you could continue gardening and not learning something new that you take with you to the next season. And I think the reason that I became so addicted to gardening when I started was because I have a musical background and I'm very right brained. And for the first time in my life, since I had been so, like involved with music in my former life, it was the first thing that I had come to in my adulthood where I didn't get so discouraged by the failures, but like every time something didn't work, I was like, aha, I know what I'm going to do different next time.
Absolutely.
And so I think using that and like using it as fuel rather than as like, I have a black thumb, I can't grow anything, just give yourself a little grace.
I think that's a great point too. And it's like, even knowing your own personality, like you can't take your personality everywhere in life and it's going to work for you in every situation, right? It's like at some point you have to do some sort of little adaptations to make things work. And for me, it's like, like I don't like planning everything, but I should at least know how many tomatoes I'm going to actually try to fit in my garden. So every year I start like 80 tomato plants and I'm like, I know I can't do this. Like, I know I can only, like, I'll try to fit them all because I love tomatoes, but there has to be some sort of learning along the way. And I think if gardening teaches you anything, it's patience. And so I think everyone can benefit from a little bit of patience, whether that's how their gardening personality plays out or just anything in life. So gardening is it's such a growth thing. And I think
it really is.
Just
it's
growing
a teacher.
your garden, like you are growing as yourself. And actually, one of the things that does come up with gardening too, that a lot of people struggle with, are pests. And I love this idea of, like, are we the pests or like who is here first? Like, what's going on? So I'd love to talk about your solution and thoughts around pests and like how you deal with it in the garden.
Well, when I first started gardening, I was so invested in it emotionally and financially and all of the above that if anything moved in my garden, it died. Like I was like, no, this is my garden. And I just had this like kill it with fire attitude. And so that was just straight out the gate. And then somewhere along the way, I realized, wait a minute, like I think there's some food chain and some semblance of how things work in nature. And like nature does it really well. I live right on the edge. We have some woods behind us and kind of see how things work in tandem. And so that was when I really began my journey into organic gardening. And the reason for that was I realized that, for example, if I left the aphids long enough, I would see a big influx of ladybugs. Or if I left the tomato hornworms, I would have some parasitic wasp or something come in. And so that was so interesting to me that was what became most important to me, was like, let me see how I can most do things like nature does it. So now I don't really do much of anything other than companion planting and adding in, pollinators and herbs and things like that.
And I think so, like this question of like pests in the garden is one that is always going to exist. And it's so interesting because I think everyone's approach at first, to some extent, is like, how do I fight this problem? Like it's here and I'm ready to go to war. And at the beginning, like even I had that approach, right? It's like, oh, like I must have done something to fail. Like now these aphids are all over my plants. And over the years, like much like yourself, from the very first season, I was not an organic gardener. And then as soon as I started reading and I got addicted, I was like, I am an organic gardener now, and I am switching. And what I realized is like that first year, like, like it might suck a little bit. You might have some losses, you might have some pain, but every year it gets a little bit better. Like things start to balance themselves out. And this approach it's kind of liberating too, because like in a sense, it's like the approach is to do nothing. Like it's to garden and work around it. And most problems do sort of work themselves out, at least in terms of pests. And so I think the idea of like that we could become the pest is totally true. Like, for example, like you brought up these aphids. If I spray and kill all these aphids, then why would the ladybugs even come to the garden in the first place? So
yeah, last night I have a summer camp membership that I do online, and we meet once a month in different gardens. And so last night I had about 15 ladies in my garden, and we were pulling up some sugar snap peas. And I said, I bet you these have aphids on them because it was getting hot. And we pulled them out, and sure enough, there were the aphids. Well, then, to my surprise, there were all these ladybug larvae, which people don't know what they look like. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, okay, hashtag this is 40. I'm about to get excited about ladybug larvae. But so I had them in my hand. I was like, y'all, this is ladybug larvae. And all of them were like, what? I've seen those before and I've killed them, or I would have sprayed that and I would have killed those. And like all these light bulbs were going off, and I was just sitting there smiling because I can remember learning those things myself. So that is the kind of thing that it's like, teach a man to fish, don't hand him a fish. Like that's what I'm trying to do, is empower you to make your own choices. And if you decide at the end of the day, or your spouse or whoever, your kid is going to douse your garden in 7 dust, like I'm not going to judge you for it, but I'm certainly not going to withhold options that, that truly do work, that require a lot less chemicals and, invasiveness. So.
Yeah. And I think, to your point there, I think it's like gatekeeping in the gardening world for me is not worth it. Like I want people to succeed in gardening, but if we give them the right options and solutions to think about, hopefully they take them. But I'd much rather have somebody still be gardening and like learning, because I think the long road to gardening is that you will eventually kind of get there. Like you will realize, like, you know what, like I've been spraying like for 2 years now and I'm over it. I have to like wear glasses. I have to be careful. Then I'm like, should I eat this? Like eventually people will get there on their own. So like I'd much rather just encourage gardening and learning than anything else.
And as you know, we need an analogy, for this section. I love to tell people, it's the analogy of like, if you give a mouse a garden, like if you give a mouse a cookie, and I think it works in 2 ways. So like, if you give a mouse a raised bed, then they're going to need a trellis to go with it. And then they're going to need a, blueberry bush or whatever. But also, if you give a mouse a garden, in the sense of, if you show them a ladybug larva, then the next time they see another bug or a set of eggs or whatever, it becomes this rabbit trail of like, I had no idea of what I had no idea of. So just really fun to watch that happen.
Yeah. So in terms of like trying to encourage us to not be pests, what are some of the solutions like that you really like? Like, do you have any specific like planting companions? I know we talked a little bit about companion planting, but there are, of course, companion plants that can help in certain ways. So like, do you have like a couple strategies, like especially for like a new gardener who's maybe just starting a kitchen garden? Like, what's kind of like your drill? Like, if you see this pest, like, just wait a little bit. Like, what are your strategies that you give your new customers?
Sure. Well, I love to teach preventative pest control rather than like, no, the masses are here and now we have to eradicate. So about this time, and I was talking to the girls about this last night, about this time of year, I do just a lot of like checking under the leaves in the mornings and just seeing, I mean, that's about as organic as it gets, is hand squishing things that you find. And, there is no greater nerdy gardening feeling than finding like a patch of like stink bug eggs and you're like, jackpot. So things like that are always the first line. And then, there's things that everybody talks about, or a lot of people do. Like with my tomatoes, I do basil and marigolds, and I really do see a big difference with that. I also encourage birds in my garden. We have bluebird boxes nearby. And I mean, anytime I go up in my garden, I've got a number of redbirds and bluebirds in and out, and they really don't do damage to my garden because since I don't spray, there's a ton of bugs for them to eat, and then they don't care about my tomatoes. So a lot of preventative, a lot of inviting in the right bugs. One specific thing, if you want to know, a specific thing I did last year was I grew alyssum from seed, which is so easy to do. And it just thrived all summer long. And I could not believe how many tiny little pollinators, different types of like wasps and bees that I don't see anywhere else, were covering that thing. And I planted those all along the base of the bed that I planted my tomatoes in. Best year I've ever had with tomatoes. It was, I don't know if it's a coincidence, but I loved it.
No, that's a brilliant one. That's one of the ones that I actually encourage the most often because for a couple of reasons. It's it looks cool. I like the way it looks. It's not,
Yeah.
it doesn't get very
It's a
big. It
spiller.
doesn't like outcompete anything. Yeah, it could spill over your raised bed. And like, yeah, it attracts all sorts of like little pollinators and all sorts of beneficial insects. So I
And it
love all
smells
that. I think those are
lovely.
all,
Yeah.
yeah, it smells like honey.
Do you have a favorite like companion planting situation or like your one go-to in the summer?
I mean, unfortunately, that just you mentioned that it's the alyssum is really like a really big one for me, but also right now I've had some pressure in the past with root knot nematode on tomatoes, and that's like if you guys don't know,
Ah,
that's if you pull the plant and you see the roots and they look like they're all covered in big knobs and chunks. Those are the nematodes invading your roots, and then they make your plant suffer. It basically can't really produce anymore. So what I do now is I've been planting specifically French marigolds everywhere because the French marigolds have like something in their roots that'll actually deter nematodes, and in some cases has done better than even chemical control, based on like a couple studies I saw. So that's like the main one I've been doing now, just because it's so
yeah.
sad to get to the end of your season of tomatoes and you're like, why didn't these produce? Like they were growing, but nothing happened. You pull the roots and you see that problem. So that's kind of the big one for me right now. And trying to attract more birds is great too, because there's like some statistic where like a baby, like a newborn baby, or freshly hatched baby, in order to like grow up to an adult baby, like could eat something like 1,000 caterpillars over those couple of weeks
Wow.
of its life just growing up. So it's like those birds are out there looking for food constantly and looking to. I've seen birds all the time with like a little bug or a little caterpillar in its mouth, and I like people are like, how come you don't have all these like pets? I'm like, I, I wish I had a good answer, but like I think a lot of it just kind of take care of itself right now. So I love that. I think it's a great advice. So I think what I'd love to hear now is you've helped so many people gardening. So I'd love to hear your story. Like, how did you start gardening, and what made you become the gardener that you are today? That's now helping empower so many people to grow food at home.
I think I shared a little bit before that I started during COVID because I had, two boys and I was at home. And I'm pretty open about my story. Like when I talk to people about, I just had my second son and had some postpartum depression that I had never dealt with before. And so I just began gardening because I thought, I can't find anything that's negative about gardening other than the weeds. And so for me, it was just very life giving. It was very invigorating. And I just kind of felt my brain like coming back to life. And we could do a whole entire podcast on all of the studies that show, what
Oh
gardening
man,
does to your
yeah.
mental health, just simply from the microbes in the soil. But that was why I started gardening. And then I began to become a little bit addicted to the fact that like the taste of the food was so much better. And I was saving some money on, herbs and certain things like that. But I always tell my clients, like, I would never mislead you to think that you're going to save $10,000 on tomatoes if you grow a garden. Like, this is not what this is about. Unless you're going
No.
to like start selling at the farmer's market and doing this full time. But the full circle moment for me was 2 years after I had my garden. We had a really big ice storm, and that's not typical in Mississippi. And my oldest son at the time was 3, and we had like 6 inches of snow on the ground. Never happens. And we were building a snowman, and I always tear up telling this story, so forgive me. But we were building a snowman, and my son said, "Mommy, hang on." And I was like, "Okay." And he ran across the field. It was like a movie. I even have a video of it. And he ran across the field. Not only did he go to my garden, I realized even though everything was covered in frostcloth and snow, he knew exactly where the carrots were. He ran and got a carrot, and he pulled out a carrot, and he
Oh
said,
man,
"I got the nose." And I was just like,
that's amazing.
like ugly cry. And it was in that moment that I realized it wasn't about like, how many tomatoes I'd grown or whatever. I just realized that like this was becoming like part of our family, and my kids were going to remember like mom's garden. And so I always tell people, everybody starts gardening for a certain reason, but usually the reason you continue gardening is far different. And
That's really
outside of
interesting.
my,
Yeah.
yeah, and outside of my own story, like I have hundreds of clients I've worked with at this point, and so many of them choose to continue gardening because, it's a place that they go to when they're caring for a loved one at home who's maybe going through an illness, or it's a place where, I have a client who actually named her garden Sharon because she shares it with other people. And so she'll text me and be like, oh man, Sharon is struggling this week. And like, I just love that, So it just really, it's like wind in my sails every time I hear somebody's story for why they continue their garden.
Yeah, that's such a cool story because it also kind of goes full circle back to the idea of like teaching people to have a green thumb. It's like you're now introducing like into your family, like into your kids, like they're gonna grow up with like a garden in their yard and they're gonna know like where do beans come from? Like they grow on plants and you pick them like this. And it's like I think so many people are disconnected from what food even looks like. Like I don't know if you were to ask a random person on the street, like, how do beans grow? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like on a plant, like do they grow underground? Like where do they get them? Like I don't know. Like and so, like we're so used to eating all these things and just getting them at the grocery store ready made, but it's like when do you even grow beans? Like when is that? Like is there a season? Like we're so disconnected now from seasonality and like food in general that like for me like that's a big part of like why I started gardening was well a big part of it was because I hated working on my PhD. I wanted an excuse to do something else. And, the pandemic offered the perfect screen because, like, I didn't have to go in to work. I could just work from home. And, like, I was too distracted. So I was just gardening, like, 4 days out of the week. And I became, like, in love with it. Like, the feeling of it, like, the connection of it. And then, like you said, like, that food, it's really, like, it just takes it up to another notch. Like, it's so sad to me now whenever like we go through this period of time where we don't have tomatoes from the garden and I don't buy tomatoes to like eat them, but I will buy them to cook with them because like they're part of so many different dishes.
It's just not the same.
No, and it's just I love this idea of like maybe the reason why you started gardening isn't the reason why you're continuing, and there's something that you will find along the way that really like brings it home to you. So yeah, like gardening and getting as many people to try, even to just try gardening. I think like the satisfaction of like watching, like when people come over, I'll have them walk around and be like, that's an eggplant. Like, look, those are onions. And they're like, oh yeah, they are onions. Like you could see. And it's just so fun. Or like have them pull a potato from underground.
We did that last night.
Yeah. It's like, it's not just good for you, but it's like it builds memories. It teaches you about like where things come from. And so yeah, like I love it. I love everything about it.
I know. So, I could talk about it for hours. So
yeah. But it's been really fun having you on and chatting about all these different ideas. And I'm going to be stealing for sure this idea of a garden and personalities because I've never thought about it, but it like just totally makes sense. Like it really does manifest. Like yourself manifests in the garden, no matter what you do. Like no matter how hard you try, there's a piece of you in your garden, and I actually just love that idea. So.
Yeah, you just got to embrace it. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to include links to you and any information about you for anyone who's curious, or maybe you're in Mississippi and you're looking to get a kitchen garden installed. So thanks for being on. It was really fun chatting with you. And maybe we'll talk to each other again soon.
Absolutely.